Hey, you all. So my name is Sasha DeBrule, and I'm going to be a professor this semester for um, advanced CMH practice, severe mental illness, and early psychosis. And I'm really excited about teaching this class. I've actually been working on it all semester. I live in Los Angeles, and I work in this office. And in between seeing clients, I have been uh, developing this curriculum that we're going to be doing for the next 15 weeks. So the thing that I want to say from the beginning, since we're just getting to know each other, is that this class is going to be unusual in that I'm I'm not like most people who would be teaching a class like this. Normally, if you were taking a early psychosis or severe mental illness class, you would be talking a lot about psychopathology and you would be using a lot of clinical frames. But the thing is that I'm actually someone who is diagnosed with a severe mental illness. And you're going to hear all about it because we have all this time together. But my relationship to the topic is very personal. So let's see. So the first class that we're going to have in person is on September 17th. The classes will be from 10 to 3 p.m. in the CIIS building. I'm looking forward to coming up to the Bay Area to visit my friends. So that's what I'll be doing before I come over to class with you all. And I think we should just get started. I think it's important when you're going to spend some time with someone and they're going to be your professor that they tell you some things about themselves. So I'm going to tell you some things about me. So those are my children. I have 2-year-old twins. Their names are Lila and Silas. And I feel like this photograph right here captures like much of my life these days, which is that I am exhausted because it is a lot of work raising kids. I have a really awesome partner, and we lived in Oakland until we moved to LA for her work back in almost a year ago. But so that's something personal about my life. Another personal thing about my life is that when I was 28 years old, I co-founded this organization called the Icarus Project, that was a network of peer-based mental health support groups and a media project for attempting to change the language and culture of what gets called mental health and mental illness. And so that, like, my view as someone who not only is diagnosed, I've spent a bunch of time locked up in psychiatric hospitals and been forcefully medicated on multiple occasions and had a very, what you would consider an intense, a severe relationship to mental illness. But I also know a lot of other people who have too. And a bunch of other people's voices are going to be in this class with us because I'm going to bring them. So I'm a writer, and what that means is that I write at least a little bit every day. Um, and I found that, I don't know what I think until I see what I write. And so I don't know what kind of relationship you have to writing, but I think it's really important to, you know, be able to reflect on things and then get some perspective, and then write it down and look at it some more. I worked in the public mental health system for a bunch of years. I'll tell you all about it. I'll tell you about all of this. Yeah, and right now I'm in private practice and I work with the Institute for the Development of Human Arts. But all in good time, students, all in good time. Um, I put the slide from the Icarus Project up here just because I feel like you need to know that like the perspective that you're going to get is from someone who really, like, the way we articulated all those years ago, and I still believe it strongly, is that rather than seeing ourselves as diseased and disordered, to be us being people diagnosed with bipolar disorder, we see ourselves as having dangerous gifts like the wings of Icarus. Um, okay, so the subject matter: what is serious mental illness? So, serious mental illness is a small subset of the 300 mental illnesses listed in the DSM. According to the National Institute of Health, SMI, which we will be referring to it often as SMI, commonly refers to a diagnosis of psychotic disorders, bipolar disorder, and either major depression with psychotic symptoms or treatment-resistant depression. SMI can also include anxiety disorders, eating disorders, and personality disorders if the degree of functional impairment is severe. SMIs are long-term illnesses involving substantial functional impairment over multiple symptom domains. These impairments often lead to an inability to maintain gainful employment, poor social support, repeated psychiatric hospitalizations, homelessness, incarceration, and coexisting substance use disorders. Okay, now, what I want to say about this, let's see what the next slide is. Oh, no, we'll go back here. I just want to say that this designation of SMI that we're going to be using this semester in many ways is, it sounds funny to say it, but it's very economic. Like SMI is a label that gets used because it causes it like oftentimes things in the larger systems we're a part of are measured in how much money it costs to take care of people, and unfortunately people get put in these diagnostic situations not necessarily because they're helpful to them, but because it's useful for the way the system runs. So we will come back to that, but I think that the only other thing I'll say here is that so much of what we're talking about when we're talking about severe mental illness has to do with trauma, and I think also there's issues of maybe biology and genetics, and that can be important. But for you all in the work that you're doing, I think it's more important to understand how to relate to people who are struggling really intensely. So let's get right to the next thing. So the three aims of this class, I'm going to teach you practical counseling skills to work with people diagnosed as severely mentally ill. And we'll be doing this in a number of different fronts and modalities. I want you to be able to understand the political and social context of and the treatment of SMI. So I think it's really important that we not just think about people as how they're presenting to us, but also what's the context, and not just like their past, but also how is the system, and maybe even the systems that we're working in, affecting their relationship to their severe mental illness. And number three, build an internal vocabulary and set of practices for doing your own inner work, with the understanding that the more you know about yourself, the more you'll be able to work with others experiencing extreme states. So this part is really important. I think that, one of the critical pieces of doing counseling work in general has to do with how we understand ourselves. The more we understand ourselves, the better able we can work with others. So I'm going to give you a lot of tools for that. And so let's keep going. Okay. So here's this quote from Octavia Butler, who I find to really kind of keep me on point when I'm starting to get stressed out about the workings of the mental health system. So all that you touch, you change, and all that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. I want us to be able to think about change in this context of the mental health system, because really, everything changes. Social conceptions, political realities, ways we understand ourselves as humans. People who are considered to be severely mentally ill are often seen to have permanent biological illnesses. But it's been my experience, and the experience of a lot of other people, that what one person might see as a permanent aspect of someone's personality might also just mean being stuck. And it can often be possible to get unstuck with the right environment and support. Many things in the current mental health system for people diagnosed with severe mental illness can actually keep them stuck. Whether we have the power to change those things individually, that's another question. But in this class, I really want you to be thinking about transformation, um, individual transformation, and then group transformation. Okay, so many of the key ideas that I'm going to be teaching you this semester about severe mental illness were actually at their most popular in this country in the 1960s and 70s, and they were obscured in the 1980s due to a shifting political climate. By the time I was a young mental patient, barely anyone was talking about them at all. This was in the early 1990s. So I was 18 years old the first time I was locked up in a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed bipolar. I didn't really begin to learn about them till I went to social work school in 2015. So I think this is an important point in and of itself. Ideas about mental health change. They change significantly, and they change depending on who's in power and the larger political social context. You know, I think there was an enormous cultural and economic shift that took place in the 1980s. I don't know how old you all are, but I was a little kid in the 1980s. So I feel like this was, I was too young to understand what was going on. But now that I'm older, I can look back at it and be like, wow, there was there was actually like a bipolar world. There was the communists and the capitalists, and then in the late 1980s, the communists fell. Mm. So I guess what I'm saying is that here we have a slide of the DSM-3, which came out in 1980, and then Ronald Reagan was also elected president of the United States in 1980, and there was a real shift. Let's see what the next slide is. Yeah, so in from basically from like the 40s to the early 80s, psychoanalysis was the main way that people were thinking about what was considered severe mental illness. And this is obviously a picture of Sigmund Freud and his idea of the ego, superego, and id. These were very, very powerful formative ideas that shaped the whole society. And what ended up happening was that by 1980 there was this power shift that changed, and it had to do with it had to do with a lot of things, and we're going to talk about it this semester. But I think at this point, we'll go back here for a second. So I mean, go back to Mr. Freud. I mean, I think the thing that I've been reflecting on all summer as I've been putting this class together is how psychoanalysis, which had all kinds of very useful ideas, and also all kinds of oppressive ideas kind of like baked into it in some ways, it created an opening, it created a space for a lot of different ways of thinking that the next paradigm that came along, the DSM-3, didn't. And I think that we'll talk about it in detail. So in this class, this is like a really sweet picture of one of my mentors. His name is Brad Lewis, and this is one of his books, Narrative Psychiatry: How Stories Can Shape Clinical Practice. In this class, I'm going to argue that there are multiple ways that we can look at what gets called severe mental illness or psychosis, and that it's really important to remember that humans are creatures of meaning, and having multiple stories and modes and visions can really benefit people. The stories to be wary of, the stories to be suspicious of, are the ones that claim that they aren't stories, the ones that claim they are the truth. And so let's talk about, for a few moments, let's talk about biopsychiatry. I think it's really important. I almost did that thing where I was like, okay, now we're going to talk about like the fish and water, and like the old fish comes along and says to the young fish like, hey, how's the water, guys? And the other fish are like, what the hell is water? But I suppose I just did it. But I think the thing about the dominant paradigm, the thing about the dominant way of looking at things, is that it becomes so dominant that everyone just accepts it as common sense. And we have all grown up in an age where the idea of biology, and thinking about mental health is the common sense. And in this class, I'm going to challenge it a lot, because I really You know, I've come to see how it's one of these stories that has a lot of power behind it, but doesn't actually have a lot of facts. You know, so I feel like the thing with biopsychiatry is that it's based on this idea that everything that we, you know, the most important thing that we need to know if we're trying to understand what's going on with someone's mental health is what's going on in their brain. And we can do genetic studies to try and figure things out, and we can do brain scans, and you know, we can give them medications and do double blind replicable trials of all kinds of things. But when it comes down to it, you know, the thing that I know, like deep in my bones, as someone who was diagnosed with a severe mental illness myself and is like very engaged in the world of people trying to help other people who are also engaged, is that this idea of biopsychiatry actually ends up doing quite a lot of harm. So the thing I want to be really clear about, okay, so I have my silly slide I've been using for years of all the psych drugs. The thing is that, to add some nuance to it, I take psychiatric drugs. I've been taking psychiatric drugs for like 23 years, since like a long ass time. And I find them very helpful. In fact, I think for a lot of people who take psychiatric drugs, I mean, it's a real mix. For some people they have a really hard time with it. For some people, they're like statistically, like I'm, lecturing to a room of you. There are a bunch of you that have taken psychiatric drugs yourself. I'd be curious to hear your experiences. For people like me who are diagnosed with what's considered to be a severe mental illness, and let's just be clear, like, if you looked up bipolar 1 with psychotic features in the DSM that's like sitting right there on my table, I would check off all the criteria for it. I mean, I fit the category of it. And I take the drugs, and yet I'm incredibly critical of the way the system works and thinks about it. So it's incredibly reductionist. So one of the things, there's so many, we could have a long conversation about this, but one of the things I think is really important to just state from the beginning is that there have been all these studies done that show if someone thinks, their neighbor has a biological brain disease, they're way more likely to treat them badly than if they think that they've had a hard life. Just try that one on. Like there's something about that, like there's been a lot of, over the years, there's been like so much money spent on anti-stigma campaigns to try and reduce the stigma for people who have mental illness. And the irony of those campaigns is that they're almost entirely funded by drug companies because it's in their vested interest to get people to not, feel bad about taking drugs. But for people like me who are diagnosed with bipolar, people diagnosed with schizophrenia, with the psychotic disorders, that whole thing about stigma, it doesn't really apply. People are scared of people like us. That's just culturally, that's where we're at. And there's good reasons for it. And the biological model doesn't help. And so just keep that in mind. Okay. So to summarize the last 16 slides, you could tell I worked really hard on this, right? This was a paragraph that I wrote that was going to be in your syllabus. It was going to be in the description of the class, but I cut it. Current clinical practices in the mental health field are often driven by a reductionist and outdated disease model that categorizes acute emotional distress as merely disorders of the brain. The medicalized language of SMI has the potential to obscure important conversations about structural inequity, trauma, and poverty in our society, and fails to acknowledge the sources and complexity of genuine suffering. So there you go. That's your summary of everything I just said. Now I'm going to show you a bunch more slides. Let's see where it takes us. So I recently read this book called Mind Fixers: Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness, and I'm going to give another lecture where I talk more about it because it's just like such a good read. Mm. But one of the things that she says is that, you know, she's looking at the history of biological psychiatry, which she traces actually back to Germany, before the war. That the people, I'll get into that another time. The point I just want to make here is that we're, you know, what was Octavia Butler saying about change? Like, change is always happening, and whoever is in power has the ability to control what's happening. But then there's always these forces, you know, that don't have as much power, um, and that's who you're talking to in this situation. Okay, Adrienne Marie Brown. So I am a really, I just think this person's amazing, and I put this slide in here early on just because I think, you know, in many ways Adrienne is like, I see her as a voice for the healing justice movement, which, you know, is a people of color led movement who were really, you know, reframing like the way we think about things like severe mental illness, but in a like in a larger social context. But I find in many ways like she's going to creep up a bunch in this class, and so this will not be the last you see of Adrienne Marie Brown. Okay, so here's her quote. One thing I have observed, one thing I have observed, when we are engaged in acts of love, we humans are at our best and most resilient. The love and romance that makes us want to be better people, the love of children that makes us change our whole lives to meet their needs, the love of a family that makes us drop everything to take care of them, and the love of community that makes us work tirelessly with broken hearts. I I put this slide in here at the beginning of this class because I just think it's really important. Like, I don't know any of you. I look forward to getting to know you over the course of the semester. You know, like hopefully we'll get to know each other some in like a, you know, in a significant way. But if you're going to go work in the public mental health system, there you have to like figure out what it is that's important to you and why you're doing it. You know, there's a lot of people working in the system who are very burnt out because they have lost sight of what's important to them, and I think love is really important. Okay. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk through things that I'm just like totally not going with my notes. I'm just talking here. But I think what I'm doing, my plan here is that I'm gonna go through some basic ideas of, you know, okay, if we're not using biopsychiatry, how am I seeing severe mental illness? How do I want you to try on looking at it over the course of the semester? And I think that this language of extreme states is very important. Anyone who is diagnosed with a severe mental illness is living with extreme states of consciousness. I feel like this language of extreme states of consciousness, I know it initially from Arnold Mindell, who's like a neo-Jungian process-oriented, you know, psychology guy who we'll be studying a little bit. But this window of tolerance diagram, I think it actually comes from Pat Ogden. I mean, there's a few different like in the world of somatic in the world of somatic psychology, there's like a number of different people who like talk about this. But the basic idea, and you'll be seeing it in class, is that when we're in our window of tolerance, we have the ability to pay attention. Like you're watching this video right now, I'm hoping that you're in your window of tolerance. And if you're not paying attention in the video, you might realize that you're hyper aroused, or you're like, you know, reacting to other stuff going on inside yourself, or stuff that's going on in your outside environment. Or you might be hypo aroused and be depressed and lethargic, you know. And either way, the idea is to be able to come back into the window of tolerance. This can be very challenging if you're in a, you know, a state of psychotic mania. But to understand, or like psychotic suicidal depression, as it were, but to understand that it's a continuum, you know, and to not do the thing, don't get caught in the trap of thinking people with severe mental illness are somehow different than us. Like they may be more extreme, but it's not like they're, you know, there's something different about their brains. It's like I just don't buy that. Okay, internal family systems. We are going to be talking a lot about internal family systems. In fact, if I like do what I was planning to do today, I'm going to record a whole video about internal family systems that I'm going to want you to watch. But it can be incredibly helpful when you're working with people diagnosed with severe mental illness to realize that people have different parts and to understand those parts. And then to understand that everybody has a self. But we're going to talk about this so much that I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Okay, so this is an idea. Remember I showed you that slide of Brad Lewis and the narrative psychiatry? So Brad, he's a psychiatrist, and he became a psychiatrist in the early 80s, which is like when the paradigm was shifting. And so he trained in psychoanalysis, and then they wanted him to be doing all this biopsychiatry stuff, and he wasn't into it. So he went back to school and he got a PhD in philosophy and cultural studies, and he studied Foucault. He wrote, and he wrote, he's a deep thinker. But one of the things that he says that I think is useful for you all to think about is that in the current day, mental illness or severe mental illness really exists on one side of the academy, and that's the academy of the hard sciences. It was like, that was the paradigm shift. They were like, this is a real biological science, this is a real, and so we're going to study it scientifically. Meanwhile, there's like thousands of years of people reckoning with these same issues, but it was in the realm of philosophy, it was in the realm of literature, it was in the realm of mythology, it was in the realm of poetry, it was, and what I want to say to you all is that if you're going to do this work in the world, remember a minute ago I was talking about love, like one way to think about it is like, what is it that you love? What is it that you care about? And figuring out how to bring that into the work that you do, and bringing that with the people that you work with. So yeah, thank Brad Lewis for this idea. Okay, so systems thinking. So I have just done like a deep dive into family systems thinking this summer. And I've been wanting to do it for a long time, and you all have given me the opportunity. But the ability to be able to think about individuals as part of larger systems is really important. It's like super critical, and we're going to be talking a lot about it. And I think that it can be super useful to think of the role of someone with severe mental illness and what role do they play in the system. So in systems thinking, right, we're not just looking at individuals, we're looking at the relationships between individuals. And oftentimes people who have these like intense diagnoses, they play particular roles in the way the system is working. So we'll be talking about that. So shadow work. So Carl Jung, who I kind of had read around for many years, but this summer I got to do a deeper dive into my reading of Jungian philosophy, and I read a good chunk of his memoir. He talks about the shadow as like the shadow in an individual it's the part of ourselves that we don't acknowledge. Like if you're acknowledging it, it's not your shadow anymore. It's like the shadow is the part we don't see. And everybody has a shadow, aspects of themselves that they're other parts of themselves are uncomfortable with. And I think that I'm actually going to give you an exercise later to reflect on that when we're doing the IFS stuff. But I think this idea of the personal shadow is very important for doing work with others. But also, so I'll come back to Arnold Mindell again. Back in the 80s, he wrote a book called City Shadows, Psychological Interventions in Psychiatry. And so he was someone who was very inspired by Carl Jung. And what what he was articulating was this idea that, okay, individuals have shadows, but also the societies that we live in have shadows, and individuals in those societies like play the role of those shadows. And I would argue, the way he does, that the people on our streets. So if y'all are in San Francisco, I'm familiar. I'm familiar with that neighborhood where CIIS is, you know, and like in my neighborhood here in Los Angeles, and New York City, where I'm from, like the way the economics are set up, there's all these people who are out on the street, and other people don't like looking at them, and they're like the city shadows, and we're, you know, this is a class of about that, in a way. And I think that to be able to really um, reckon with it and make sense of like the larger society, we have to go back to ourselves and look at our own shadows, and what is it that we are not acknowledging. Okay. So so that's a picture of me a few years ago, and more impressively, that is a picture of the largest psychiatric institute, or the most powerful, like literally like economically powerful psychiatric institute in the world. It is called the New York State Psychiatric Institute. And I worked there for 3 years. And I had this job where I developed trainings, and then I trained peer workers. And we'll get a chance to talk some about this thing about the peer specialists and peer worker movement. Um, Working on first episode psychosis teams, and boy, did I learn a lot from that job, man. It was really hard. It was really, I mean, because I have a master's degree, but like I'm really out about the fact that I'm like diagnosed with a severe mental illness, and that's why they hired me. But then I was working on a team with a bunch of other people who did not have that kind of experience and had not been you know held down and shot up with antipsychotic drugs in a jail cell and all those kinds of things, the kind of experiences that give you perspective. um, and I learned a lot of lessons. And so we're going to be talking about some of those lessons over the course of this class. But one of the really wonderful things that happened as part of that job was I ended up working a lot with this woman, Pat Deegan. And the thing about Pat Deegan was that she was someone like me who was diagnosed with a severe mental illness when she was young, and then she went and got a PhD in psychology and ended up like Pat Deegan is responsible for um, this language that you might hear sometimes when people talk about the mental health recovery movement. She's the one who first started using that language back in the early 90s. And so, okay, so me and Pat are here at the Psychiatric Institute. She's on the phone, like doing these calls. We're doing these calls with clinicians all the time or whatever. And one of the lessons that I learned that was like it was deep, y'all. It was deep. So get ready. You know, you can have really visionary ideas, visionary language. What does she say here? The goal of recovery is not to become normal. The goal is to embrace the human vocation of becoming more deeply, more fully human. Yeah, go Pat, right? Yeah, recovery movement. Let's do it. I had a job. The reason they hired me was because of the recovery movement. Look at my job title. My job title is recovery specialist and trainer for On Track New York and ACT. But the thing was, when Pat Deegan was talking about recovery, she meant one thing. And when a lot of those people, like the psychiatrists there, the policymakers, they had a whole other idea of what recovery meant. The psychiatrists, they were like, well, recovery means you take your medication and you make sure that you're going to work and whatever. It had nothing to do with like, what is this? The human vocation of becoming more deeply fully human. Um, and the policymakers, it was even more sinister. Like recovery for them, they were into it because it meant, drum roll, that they wouldn't have to pay for people's services. Oh, if you're recovered from your mental illness, then we don't have to pay for you. And that's like one of many lessons I learned at the Psychiatric Institute. Anyway, one of the things that happened while I was working at IDA, so this is all happening in New York City, is that the Icarus project, which had been together for many years, was going through it's like tumultuous changes. And some of the people from the Icarus project and some other people got together and started IDA, the Institute for the Development of Human Arts. And we define ourselves as a community of current or prior mental health service users and survivors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and other clinicians, activists, and artists who've come together to transform mental health care. And IDA's rocking it, y'all. IDA's been around for some years now, and you will be seeing them in this class. But the point being that how do I say it? It's like, if you're gonna think about making change in the mental health system, you have to include the people who've actually experienced, who are like the most marginalized, the people who are like at the bottom, who've experienced the system. And a lot of other ways of thinking about severe mental illness have not done that. So yeah, so like IDA has a whole online school that's like about that. And you're going to be watching this video for next week that I hope you'll find illuminating. Okay, so let's see what else I put here. So I covered most of this stuff. IFS, somatic trauma therapy. So somatic trauma therapy. So that, like, the first in-person class that we have, I'm going to be giving you a lecture on trauma and talking about how people work with trauma. And we're actually going to be doing some exercises from Generative Somatics, which is an organization. Like, I trained with Generative Somatics back in the day. Adrienne Marie Brown is also like a teacher at Generative Somatics. And I'm going to give you hopefully some very practical skills that will help you in thinking about all this stuff. We're going to be talking a bunch about this guy. In fact, I'm going to read you this quote right here, if I can find it. Here it is. So this is from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, from his memoir. Through my work with the patients, I realized that paranoid ideas and hallucinations contain a germ of meaning. A personality, a life history, a pattern of hopes and desires lie behind the psychosis. The fault is ours if we do not understand them. It dawned upon me then for the first time that a general psychology of the personality lies concealed within psychosis, and that even here we come upon the old human conflicts. Although patients may appear dull and apathetic or totally imbecilic, there's more going on in their minds, and more that is meaningful than there seems to be. At bottom, we discover nothing new and unknown in the mentally ill. Rather, we encounter substratum of our own natures. So the thing about this guy was that, he had a huge impact, like, in this country in the 1960s and 70s, and then because of the rise of biopsychiatry and neoliberalism and all this, managed care and healthcare, like, so much of that stuff just got crushed. In fact, CIIS is like one of the only places where you can, get a degree and study that stuff. So that's part of why I'm so psyched about teaching at CIIS. Anyway, we're also going to be talking about open dialogue, which is like comes out of the systemic family therapy movement. And I spent a year working on a open dialogue team in Manhattan, going to people's homes and doing family therapy. So we can be talking about that. We're going to be talking about compassion-focused therapy for distressing voice hearing and psychosis. This is like a training I recently did, and I'm like really impressed with these folks in England who are doing this cutting edge therapy for working with people with psychosis. I'm not sure. This is where the slides may go off the road. I'm not. Oh, we're going to be talking about drugs, y'all. We're going to be talking about We're going to be talking about psychiatric drugs. We're going to be talking about psychedelic drugs, talking about the drugs that close the doors of perception and open the doors of perception. And we're going to be talking about like the strange situation many people find themselves in, where they're on psychiatric drugs and they have a very hard time coming off of them. We're going to be talking about the peer movement. So that's like, I am an expert in this world, and I'll share some stuff that hopefully will be useful to you. And this was my final slide that I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I didn't finish a final slide. So anyway, point being, this is our class, and we're going to have fun. I hope you enjoyed this little introduction. Look out for the next ones from me, and I'll see you there.